one of the articles published in Cambridge University Press, "Why Are Modern Famines So Deadly? The First World War in Syria and Palestine." Without further ado, I just like to hand the floor to Dr. Zachary. Dr. Zachary, the time is yours, please.
Okay, thank you. Just a quick question. How much time do I have?
Around 40 minutes, and we will follow to the ask and answer question. Is it okay?
40 minutes. Great. That sounds great. And I have some slides. So can I share my screen?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Let's go. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen. And what I have here is it's a slide deck about the history of Gaza and Hamas. And I think that's going to help us understand in particular what is happening right now in Israel and Palestine. And so Gaza is home to 2 million Palestinians, more than half of whom are under 18. Something like 70% of people living in Gaza today are actually refugees from the Israel-Palestine War in 1948. And so from 1948 to 1967, Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip. And then from 1967 to 2007, Israel occupied the territory. And then from 2007 until the present, the territory has been under Israeli blockade from the outside, and it's being run by Hamas from the inside. Hamas is an organization that originally was founded in 1973 as an Islamic charity organization. And then in 1988, it transitioned into a militant organization. It retained its charity activities, but also became a militant organization. And that's sort of at a high level, just some basic background and context for Gaza. I'm going to skip this slide. So, let's just start with the Israeli occupation beginning in 1967. So there was the Six-Day War. Israel conquers the West Bank, it conquers Gaza, it conquers Jerusalem, it conquers Sinai, and it conquers the Golan Heights. But I want to focus on Gaza. So when Israel occupied Gaza, it led to the creation of 70,000 more refugees. So remember, there were 750,000 refugees created in 1948, and then another 70,000 were created refugees when Israel conquered and occupied Gaza. And those first 20 years of Israel's occupation of Gaza, from 1967 to 1987, Israel killed on average 32 Palestinians in the occupied territories in Gaza and the West Bank. It killed 32 Palestinians per year, every year for 20 years. This is long before there were any terrorists. This is long before there's any rockets flying into Israel. Basically, Israel imposed this brutal military occupation on Gaza. And it also frequently arrested and deported any Palestinian who resisted and protest. In one case alone, in 1976, Israel arrested 33,000 Palestinians in the occupied territories. So it was a brutal occupation. Israel banned any political activity. So if you are a Palestinian in Gaza or the West Bank, it is forbidden for you to organize politically during this period of time from 67 to 87. It is forbidden for you to wave a Palestinian flag. It is forbidden for you to make artwork of red, green, black, and white, because that would be inciting to violence, according to Israeli military logic for this 20-year period. And of course, Israel also censored textbooks and magazines and newspapers, and it banned many books. Israel also imposed draconian economic policies on Gaza. And so Israel suffocated investment, industry, and entrepreneurship. And the way it did this was through its permit regime. So Israel required Palestinians to obtain permits to do anything, right? To install a water device, to perform electrical work, to connect a generator, to plant new citrus trees, to do all these things. All these business activities became very difficult to do in the occupied territories. And one of the reasons Israel did this was because it didn't want Israeli firms, Israeli companies to face competition from Palestinian companies in the territories. So it imposed all of these restrictions and limitations through the permit regime on Palestinians in the occupied territories. Another thing Israel did to suffocate the Palestinian economy in the territories from 67 to 87 was that it shut down Arab financial institutions. It froze the assets of many banks in the occupied territories. And as a result, there were no credit markets. There was no lending and borrowing markets in the occupied territories. So basically, Palestinians were handcuffed in trying to build companies that could create a self-sustaining economic base. So instead, Palestinians were forced to find work inside Israel from 67 to 87. Of course, this had disastrous consequences in the 1990s and 2000s when Israel started to impose lockdowns and it started to shut down the territories. So for 20 years, it made Palestinians dependent on the Israeli labor market. And then for the next 20 years after that, it started to shut down the Palestinians and prevent them from entering into the Israeli labor market. And just to give one statistic here, as a result of this suffocating economic policy, there was actually less land under cultivation in 1987 than there was in 1947. So another thing Israel did was that it prevented families from reunifying. And during this period, this 20-year period, the first 20 years of Israel's occupation. So if you were a Palestinian from Gaza and you had a wife or a brother or a sister living in Israel, you couldn't go you were forbidden from settling in Israel with your immediate family. Part of Israel's policy of making it difficult for any Palestinian to obtain Israeli citizenship. Now that kind of brings us to the 1980s. And so, like I said, these policies are brutal, they're oppressive, and it leads to protests. From 1977 to 1981, there were something like 500 disturbances. This is Israeli military wording. There were 500 disturbances, and then from 1982 to 1987, there were 3,000 disturbances in the Palestinian occupied territories. And so this led to an uprising. The first Intifada, as it's known, the first uprising. And just to get a better sense of why Palestinians rose up in protests, primarily nonviolent protests, in 1986, there was an interesting poll that was conducted. Something like 1,000 Palestinians in the occupied territories were asked a bunch of questions, and these are the results. Something like 48% of Palestinians had been arrested, 50% had been beaten, 55% had been harassed or insulted at Israeli military checkpoints, 23% had their property confiscated, 34% were forbidden from traveling abroad, 18% had their homes demolished or sealed, and 16% were deported, and then 38% had been fined by the military. So all of this is to say that Palestinians inside the occupied territories were exposed to all of this brutality. They were exposed to physical abuse and verbal abuse and humiliation and dehumanization. And I think this is the context within which Palestinians rose up in 1987. As I said, the uprising broke out in December 1987 when an Israeli truck driver struck and killed 4 Palestinians in Gaza. And as a result, there was this mass outbreak of protests. There were protests, there were strikes, there were riots, there were boycotts, and infamously, there were Palestinian kids throwing stones at Israeli tanks and Israeli soldiers. And in just the first, and so just to give you a sense, in the first year alone of the uprising, Israel killed 142 Palestinians in Gaza, and Palestinians killed 0 Israelis. And I think it was that brutality and that grotesque violence that really radicalized Hamas. We're going to get to Hamas in a minute. But remember, up until 1988, Hamas is still a charity organization. It's not even called Hamas at that point. It's actually called Al-Mujama al-Islamiyya. It's an Islamic charity. And it was really that, I think, that first year of Israel's brutal suppressing of the first Intifada that radicalized Hamas. And then they turned to violence after that. But just to get a sense, in the first 2 years of the uprising, 175,000 Palestinians passed through Israeli jails. 30,000 Palestinian kids needed medical treatment. 10,000 of those kids had their bones broken. And something like a fifth So we're talking 2,000 Palestinian kids under the age of 5 had their bones broken by Israeli military. Okay, so that is the brutality that Israel, that Israel inflicted on the Palestinians. And so over the course of the first Intifada from 1987 to 1993, Palestinians killed 160 Israelis, and Israel killed 1,200 Palestinians. And this is a trend we're going to see over and over again. Israel kills far more Palestinians than Palestinians kill Israelis. I think I would call this the doctrine of disproportionality, which is we will make the Palestinians suffer and pay the price for killing Israelis. Now, let's talk about Hamas. So, as I said, Hamas was founded in 1973 by by a Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, and originally it was a charity organization. They, supported cultural activities and social services. They helped the poor. They helped orphans. They opened up many health clinics. They had after-school programming, educational programs. So this was basically the first 15 years from 73 to 88. Hamas is a charity organization. And then, like I said, I think it was that first year in the Intifada where things changed and they decided to become more militant. But even before so then in 1988, in August, they put out this charter that calls for the destruction of Israel. I think let's actually, so in 1988, Hamas publishes a charter in which it calls for an Islamic state throughout all of Palestine, and it calls for the destruction of the state of Israel. But just to back up, in the months prior to that charter coming out, you had a number of Hamas leaders. One of them, his name was Mahmoud al-Zahar. He basically puts out a peace offer to Israel at the time. He submits this proposal to Israel's defense minister, Yitzhak Rabin. And the proposal, if you can read it here, basically says, look, Israel has to withdraw from the occupied territories. It has to restore Palestinian rights. It has to allow Palestinians the right to self-government. And if it does that, then we will make peace with you, Israel. And then the same thing, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin himself, the founder of Hamas himself, says something quite similar in 1988. He says, if Israel acknowledges the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and the right of the refugees from 1948 to return to their homes, we are open to making peace with Israel. But of course, Israel rejected those peace offers, and Hamas instead turned to violence. But I think it's important to remember that even in those first few years, Hamas is really very slow to embrace violence. So in 1989, is the first attack that Hamas carries out on Israeli military personnel. But it wasn't until 1990, in December 1990, that Hamas carries out its first attack on Israeli civilians. And Hamas militants kill 3 Israeli civilians in 1990 in response to an Israeli brutally suppressing a demonstration in Jerusalem 2 months earlier that killed 22 Palestinians. And I think it was, again, you see this pattern repeats itself. In October 1990, Israel slaughters 22 Palestinians who are unarmed, and they're protesting, and Israel kills them, and then Hamas gets more radicalized and then commits its first attack against Israeli civilians. Same thing happened in 1994. Again, even from 1991 to 1994, Hamas carries out a few attacks, but not that many. Really, it's not until after 94 when Baruch Goldstein, a radical Israeli right-wing settler, goes into the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, in Khalil, and he slaughters 29 Palestinian worshippers. And I think that is the moment that Hamas really becomes radical, and then it starts to commit all of these terrorist, let's call them terrorist attacks in Israeli cafes and bus stations and whatever else. But I think it's important to remember that really, I think it was Israeli violence and Israeli brutality and Israel's slaughtering of so many Palestinians in the first Intifada that really radicalized Hamas. Now, meanwhile, in the 1990s, you have the Oslo process, of course. And just to get I don't have a slide on it, but recall that in 1993, the Israeli Prime Minister the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, they signed this agreement. And the agreement basically stipulates that Israel will gradually start to transfer authority and power over to Hamas, over to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which really evolves into the Palestinian Authority, the PA. So the PA becomes this new Palestinian sort of government in the occupied territories that is gradually given more autonomy. Gradually, Israel starts to transfer over small areas of the West Bank and Gaza to the Palestinian Authority. But of course, the Palestinian Authority it makes all these mistakes, and it wastes lots of money, and there's a lot of corruption. And in one internal investigation in 1997, it's found that something like $300 million disappears, that it's basically wasted. And in fact, many of the many senior officials in the Palestinian Authority are actually convicted of embezzling and stealing tens of millions of dollars from the Palestinian treasury for their own personal benefit. And so Palestinians are frustrated with their own leaders in the PA. They're frustrated with Yasser Arafat, who is perceived to be corrupt, and so that contributes to the rise of Hamas. More people are supporting Hamas because they're seen to be less corrupt than the Palestinian Authority. And so during this period, during the Oslo period, right? So maybe I'll say one more brief word about it. The whole concept was that Israel and Palestinians were supposed to be building trust with one another. The idea was we'll gradually transfer over authority of these territories to the Palestinians. And at the same time, both sides are supposed to be showing trust and building trust with one another. It's actually the exact opposite that happens. Israel, not only Israel expands its settlement enterprise, it actually doubles the number of Israeli settlements from 1993 to 2000. Israel doubles the settlement population. Okay, so during a time during a time when Israel is supposed to be building trust, it's actually eroding trust. Meanwhile, Israel is also locking down the territories. Like I said, you remember how during the 70s and 80s, all these Palestinians are working in Israel, but by the 90s, Israel decides that it's pursuing a policy basically of separation. It wants to separate itself from the Palestinians. And so what it does is it starts closing down, locking down Palestinians in the Palestinian occupied territories, which leads to mass unemployment and leads to total impoverishment. In fact, during the periods of peak lockdown, where Israel prevents Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank from leaving, there's 70% unemployment rate in Gaza. And so Palestinians are supposed to be, being given all this extra autonomy, while at the same time, they're being shut out from the Israeli labor market. And, they're living in a state of impoverishment as a result of these lockdowns. So in any case, so kind of basically during this time period when, both sides are building trust to eventually get to a point within 5 years when Israel and the Palestinians are going to eventually negotiate the ultimate final status agreements. Basically, Israel is taking over the land that is eventually supposed to be negotiated over in 2000, right? And so I think, again, that creates even more frustration and anger on the Palestinian side, where Palestinians see Israel undermining the trust that it's supposed to be building. I'm going to skip this slide. So by 2000, Israel and the Palestinians sit down to negotiate this land, the West Bank and Gaza, to negotiate who's ultimately going to control this land. Those negotiations fail. It's not really worth getting into the details. A lot has been written about the Camp David Accords of 2000 and the Taba Accords of 2001. But basically, these negotiations break down for a million reasons. Both sides, I would say there's a lot of blame to go around on both sides. The negotiations fail. And immediately afterwards, this guy, Ariel Sharon, who I believe is defense minister at the time, goes up to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound and with his whole entourage of security officers and aides and officials, and they take this kind of tour around the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the holiest site for Palestinian Muslims, at the third holiest site in all of Islam. He goes up and basically asserts Israeli authority over the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this enrages Palestinians, and there's protests as a result. And within the first, the day immediately after Ariel Sharon goes up to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Israel kills 4 Palestinian kids. And in the next 3 weeks, Israel kills another 14 Palestinian kids. And it was, again, that brutal violence, I think, that drives Hamas to, and also other Palestinian militant organizations to fight. And so you get this outbreak of the second Intifada, the second uprising from 2000 to 2004, during which Israel kills something like 3,000 Palestinians, and Palestinian militants kill 1,000 Israelis. Meanwhile, during the second Intifada, Israel, it's demolishing tons of homes. It demolishes 4,000 Palestinian homes. It arrests 6,000 Palestinians. It destroys 10% of Gaza's agricultural land and uproots 226,000 trees. Again, this is a time when Palestinians are committing attacks, suicide attacks, blowing up buses in Israel and blowing up cafes. And at the same time, Israel is going into the Palestinian occupied territories, imposing lockdowns, imposing closures, 600 checkpoints, arresting mass number of people, destroying mass number of homes, killing thousands of Palestinians. And eventually, by 2005, the violence kind of quiets down. And that brings us to really Hamas's rise to power. And I think this is probably the part of the presentation that most people are going to be most interested in, because this is really where we're kind of setting the stage for what happened on October 7th, 2023. In 2006, there are elections in the occupied territories. And although Hamas stayed out of elections from 1993 to 2006, in 2006, it decides to participate in those Palestinian elections. It decides it can have more impact within the system than by just rejecting this whole system altogether. Because remember, up until 2006, Hamas's point of view was this whole thing, the Palestinian Authority, these negotiations with Israel, it's all illegitimate because Israel's an illegitimate state, and so we're not going to engage in it. But by 2006, they basically accept the framework that Israel and the Palestinians have created. So they basically kind of tacitly acknowledge Israel's existence. They tacitly acknowledge the legitimacy of these elections through their participation in them. And lo and behold, to everyone's surprise, Hamas wins. So in 2006, Hamas wins legislative elections in the Palestinian territories. But in Gaza, the Fatah officials, Fatah being the political party of Yasser Arafat and then Mahmoud Abbas, so Fatah refuses to give up power. And so call it a coup if you want, call it Hamas has a legitimate right to take power in Gaza because they won elections, call it whatever you want, but Hamas takes power by force in Gaza in 2007. And then Israel basically imposes a blockade on Gaza starting in 2007 to punish the people of Gaza for electing Hamas. And those are the words, and we know that because Israeli leaders at the time expressed that sentiment, that the blockade is a punishment. But of course, I think it's often forgotten that, today most people see, especially after October 7th, believe that Hamas is a terrorist organization, that Hamas is just commits all this violence and attacks civilians and doesn't recognize Israel. But actually, it's a much more complicated story than that, because in 2006, Ismail Haniyeh, he publishes an article in The Guardian basically saying, look, Hamas is for peace. We want to put an end to the bloodshed. We and we will want to do this through peaceful means. If the world is willing to engage in a constructive and fair process in which we and the Israelis are treated equally. So that was the demand, was just treat us equally as the Israelis, and we're open to peace. Khalid Mash'al, who is another senior Hamas official, says something pretty similar in 2007 and again in 2008. He says, quote, "We agree to a Palestinian state on the 67 boundaries, i.e. Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, with Jerusalem as the capital, with genuine sovereignty, with no settlements, but without recognizing Israel. We offer the Israelis a 10-year truce." All of these offers are completely rejected by Israel. Israel has no interest in a Palestinian state, especially one that's going to be led by Hamas. And so all of these peace offers in 2006 and 2007 and 2008 are rejected by Israel. I want to say a brief word about kind of Hamas's rule in Gaza. So Hamas is now ruling Gaza from the inside from 2007 to the present. However, of course, Israel is imposing a blockade on Gaza from the outside. So Israel controls all the borders except for one border that Egypt controls. And for the most part, Egypt colludes with Israel to keep that border closed. But basically, from 2007 to to the present, Hamas has been in control of Gaza. They have not held any elections since 2007. So they run basically an autocratic government. There's no real sense of democracy. The one thing I would say as well, though, is that, Hamas won this election and it was free and fair. There were democratic elections. There were many international observers that declared that these elections were free and fair. And in response, the international community imposes blockade on Gaza, which again, like if the international community does in fact believe in democracy and does believe that elections ought to be free and fair, then why is it that they punish the people of Gaza for having, conducted this democratic election? But in any case, Hamas is brutal. They do not rule. They arrest political opponents. They arrest anyone they think is collaborating with Israel, and in many cases execute them. So it's a brutal regime. In any case, that's kind of what I would say about that. Let's move to the next slide. So there's another thing that's quite interesting here, which is basically this very complicated relationship between Israel and Hamas. From the early 1980s, Israel actually funded Hamas. Okay, and a lot of people don't realize this, but Israel supported Hamas in the early 1980s because it pursued a policy of divide and conquer, divide and rule, a classic colonial strategy, right? Which is if your adversaries are divided rather than united, they're much more easy to defeat. And so the idea in Israel in the 1980s was that PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, those people are the enemies because they're violent and they're revolutionary. But this charity organization is peaceful and apolitical. And so Israel actually funded them in the early 80s. By the 90s, Israel was obviously not funding them and was trying to destroy them. But then things changed again. And so basically over the past, I would call it 10 years, Israeli leaders have again basically empowered Hamas and have sought to keep Hamas in power in the Gaza Strip because they want to keep basically Gaza and the West Bank divided, right? So you have right now is the Palestinian Authority with Mahmoud Abbas is in control in Ramallah in the West Bank, and you have Hamas in control of Gaza, and Israeli leaders love that. They love Palestinians being divided because then they never have to give up any power. They never have to negotiate with Palestinians because they can always say, how could we possibly negotiate with them when they themselves are divided and they can't even agree amongst themselves to present a unity government to us. Besides, Hamas is a terrorist organization. How can we negotiate with them? Right. So that's been the Israeli point of view now for more than a decade. And so, Bibi Netanyahu for the past 10 years has basically not only allowed Hamas to remain in power, but even has allowed Qatari officials from Qatar to fly to Tel Aviv and transport suitcases full of money and cash directly to Hamas. So it's a very complicated relationship between Israel and Hamas. Recall that, actually, this isn't really that relevant, but basically, recall that in 2005, Israel withdrew its settlers, from Gaza. There were 6,000 Israeli settlers living in Gaza. Israel withdrew those settlers. And so, Israel's idea was, hey, we're going to give up the Gaza and, let the Palestinians have control there. In fact, it was a PR stunt because Israel did not actually give up power in Gaza. Instead, it retained control of 6 of the 7 land borders. It retained control of the coastline. It retained control of the airspace and the groundwater and the telecommunication networks, as well as the population registry, as well as the electricity. So Israel maintained basically, if you have the ability to cut off water and electricity and food to a population, you're the one in control of that population, not Hamas. So think of it like a prison where within the prison, Hamas is allowed to decide which prisoners get how much food and which prisoners are allowed to go out into the courtyard. But from the outside, Israel is controlling all the entry and exit points. And I think that is basically how to think about what Israel did in 2005 with the disengagement plan. Like I said, Israel in 2007 imposes blockade on Gaza, and it's been a brutal blockade. It's today 80% of how this is everything I'm about to say now is really before before October 7th, right? Because on October 7th everything changed, but before October 7th, there was widespread devastation and poverty in the Gaza Strip. 80% of households required food aid. 80% of households do not have enough food, and they require assistance from the UN. That's the state in Gaza for 16 years. These people lack access to safe drinking water. We're going to get to all this in the next slides, but let's keep moving because we only have maybe 10 minutes left. So by 2010, the United Nations declared that this blockade that Israel imposed on Gaza was illegal because it was inflicting disproportionate damage on the civilian population of Gaza. Okay, so it was imposing collective punishment, and it's illegal under international law to collectively punish people for the actions committed by their government. The second reason it was declared illegal was because the motivation, according to Israeli officials at the time, was to punish the people of Gaza for electing Hamas. Again, that's illegal. Let's skip this slide. So by 2010, you have many humanitarian organizations trying to break the blockade. And you'll recall in 2010, you had a flotilla depart from Turkey, trying to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza. And Israel took over those ships, those boats, and it murdered 11 of those Turkish citizens on board one of the ships. And we know those Turkish citizens were murdered because in the autopsy reports, they were shot at a distance. And so, these people were just executed for trying to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza. Of course, the people in Gaza are not able to leave. It's a blockade. There's a really the vast majority of the 2 million people living in Gaza have never left. And most people in the Gaza Strip are unemployed, something like 50% unemployment rate. And then among youth, the unemployment rate among youth graduating university is 75%. Okay, and you wonder why people have no hope, because there's no jobs, because there's a blockade. And so I think Israel has really impoverished 2 million people during the past 16 years. Of course, there's also an electricity crisis. Israel again controls how much electricity goes in and out of Gaza. And so for really the last 16 years, Gazans don't have enough electricity. I would say overall, maybe they have 50% amount of the electricity they need. Every day there's rolling blackouts between, maybe they get 4 hours of electricity a day, maybe they get 15 hours, maybe they get 10 hours. Every day is different. The electricity crisis also worsens the water crisis because, of course, you need electricity to pump water from the wells. You need electricity to run the desalination plants. You need electricity for all these things. And so this has led to, again, massive devastation as a result of no electricity. The other thing that electricity is needed for, by the way, is hospitals need electricity to run, to provide all the medical services they provide. And so hospitals don't have electricity, which means they're pushing off non-urgent surgeries. And it also means they just can't offer a lot of services, medical services, to the people of Gaza. Power cuts also force Gazans to use firewood to cook, which increases the risk of respiratory diseases. Gazans don't have enough electricity to operate fans. They don't have lights at night, so night workers are put at risk. So all these problems as a result. The other thing you need electricity for, by the way, is to filter and treat raw sewage. And Israel does, and Gaza does not have enough electricity to treat the raw sewage. And so as a result, something like 26% of diseases in Gaza are related to people drinking or bathing in or swimming in dirty water. In fact, according to one estimate, 73% of Gaza's coastline, so the Mediterranean coast, 73% is polluted with sewage water. Okay, and that was as of 2017. So this creates, so again, you need electricity to treat the raw sewage, and there isn't enough electricity, and so you have raw sewage flowing in the streets. And it's just a rancid smell all over Gaza because there's just raw sewage all over the streets. The other thing Israel does is it prevents Palestinians from fishing, further out into the Mediterranean Sea. And so, according to the Oslo process, remember that process that started in '93, Israel was supposed to deliver to allow Palestinians to fish up until a certain point, and they basically reduced that by half, starting in 2007. And in addition to reducing the area Palestinians are allowed to fish in 2022 alone, Israel, Palestinians always go past that line because they're trying to subsist. They're all impoverished, so they're fishing further out. Israel shoots at them. And actually, in just 2022 alone, 14 fishermen were injured and 47 were arrested. There's not enough really fresh drinking water or clean drinking water. So 90% of homes, if you turn on the faucet, salt water comes out because there's not enough fresh water. Basically, in fact, the estimates vary, 78%, 97%, but basically 97% of the available water is undrinkable. This creates massive problems, and the problems are getting worse and worse. So basically, and so people resort to drinking unsafe water, which causes kidney problems. And just really over the past number of years, every year the Shifa hospital, which is the biggest hospital in the Gaza Strip, has reported that there's a 13 to 14% increase in kidney problems every year. Also, we're going to get to this in the next slide, in the next few slides, but Israel has also waged 5 wars on Gaza over the past 16 years. I'm going to talk about each one in a minute. We only have maybe, let's say, 6 minutes left. But as a result of all these wars, you have many people who are still homeless. Long before October 7th, you had many thousands of Palestinians that were still homeless from many of these previous wars. There's a public health crisis. I want to move through these. There's also, so something like 20,000 Palestinians were denied exit permits in 2022 to receive medical care outside of the Gaza Strip because, Gazans, they can't get the treatment they need in Gaza. So they apply for permits to get a medical treatment outside, and they're usually denied. And so this is just one case. You have Fatima al-Masri here, pictured on the right. She was 2 years old when she was denied an exit permit, and she died as a result. And she's not unique. There's dozens, if not hundreds, of Palestinians that die in Gaza every year because Israel does not allow them to leave to get the medical treatment they need. There's also a mental health crisis in Gaza. There's a food security crisis. The vast majority of people are food insecure. They do not have enough food. There's also an education crisis because in basically every war that Israel has waged on Gaza, it destroys many schools. And so there's overcrowding in the schools. And that also, causes the Palestinian education sector to suffer. So I want to end on these last 5 wars because this is, I think, really to understand the rage and anger that Palestinians feel in Gaza. I think you have to understand these 5 wars that Israel has waged on Gaza in 2008, in 2012. I mean, depending on how you count a war, right? Because Israel bombs Gaza often, even when it's not a full-scale war, they still are bombing Gaza. But the 5 main wars, let's say, are 2008, 2012, 2014, 2019, 2021, and obviously 2023. And altogether in those 5 wars, Israel killed 3,500 Palestinians, okay? All the while, Palestinian militants like Hamas and Islamic Jihad killed 185 Israelis. So again, you see this disparity where Israel kills 20 times the number of Palestinians that Palestinians kill Israelis. And in every single one of these conflicts, human rights organizations like Amnesty International, B'Tselem, and Human Rights Watch have documented apparent war crimes in which there's no justifiable military target, but Israel is bombing civilian areas and residential buildings. So let's talk about these wars real quickly. 2008 was one of the worst ones. Israel killed 1,400 Palestinians. The Goldstone report, which was an investigation into war crimes committed, found that in 10 out of 11 cases that Israel bombed civilians and killed civilians, there was no justifiable military target identified. In other words, 90% of the bombs dropped on Gaza were targeting civilians in 2008. And I think you have to understand that when you're being bombed every single day for 22, this war lasted 22 days. When you're being bombed every day for 22 days and you're being targeted, your innocent civilians are being targeted. That leads to outrage. Same thing happened in 2012. Israel killed only 171 Palestinians. Palestinians killed 10 Israelis. Palestinians killed 10 Israelis. Then the next war was actually the worst one of all. In 2014, Israel killed 2,200 Palestinians in Gaza, 1,500 of whom were civilians, 550 of whom were children. Okay, Israel launched 6,000 airstrikes on Gaza. Again, mostly in residential areas, striking civilians. And the UN investigated 15 attacks. And in 6 of the 15 attacks that killed civilians, no military target was identified. Israel was just bombing innocent civilians. All the while, Hamas killed 6 Israeli civilians during that war. So Israel kills 1,500 Gazan civilians. Hamas kills 6 Israeli civilians. That brings us to 2018, when in March, tens of thousands of Palestinians, as you can see here on the image, protest. It's a non-violent protest movement. They're unarmed. They're not even affiliated with Hamas. They're just civilians going to the fence, protesting, demanding the right of return, demanding an end to the siege and the blockade. In response, Israel killed 223 of them. In one day alone, on May 14th, 2018, Israel executed with snipers, because remember, Israeli military on the other side of the fence. Israel executed 60 Palestinian unarmed civilians in a single day. It was a massacre. Not a single Israeli experienced any harm during this conflict, but Israel killed 223 Palestinians. That brings us to the last war in 2021, in which Israel killed 261 Palestinians and Palestinians killed 14 Israelis. So again, mass brutality, many civilians killed, and very few Israelis killed on the other side. So I think, and just the last point I would make here is that the towns surrounding Gaza, the Israeli cities and towns surrounding Gaza, have also suffered tremendously over the past 16 years. 40% of the Israeli children in border towns like Sderot suffer from PTSD. So Israel, especially in the towns surrounding Gaza, have also suffered tremendously. The last point I want to make here is that Israel prevents journalists from entering the Gaza Strip. And so all the media coverage that we're seeing, all the, the CNNs and the Fox Newses and, the New York Times and all of these, Washington Post, Israel does not allow their journalists to enter Gaza. And so that is part of the reason why there is such a media bias. Why, if you look at the US media, for example, there's so much coverage of Israeli civilian deaths, so much coverage of Israeli suffering, but very, very little coverage of Palestinian suffering, because Israel does not allow the journalists to enter Gaza to report on it. And then it bombs, and then it frequently attacks journalists in Gaza. We saw, in the 2021 war, Israel destroyed 20 Palestinian and international media outlets. So Israel plays an active role in preventing the coverage coming out of Gaza. And I think that's the final point I would make in thinking about the way in which this current war that's being waged on Gaza is being covered by the media. And so I'm gonna end my presentation there. I haven't said anything about the current war, and I'm sure everyone is probably following that very closely. But I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if people have questions. But I'll end there. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak.
There's so many things, Okay, so I just want to go to the next sessions. There are some questions directed to you. Do you mind to answer.
Did you want me to answer some questions, or do we have time, or do you need to move on to the next speaker?
Yeah, I think yeah, I think you can like first we can just let the Zoom audience to get their answer question.
I do see some questions here.
After that, we let the audience hear our faculty to. If anyone here to want to give questions, just don't hesitate. Yeah.
There's a question here. Why Israel's aggression is always getting more brutal during the Netanyahu regime? It was not as brutal during the reign of Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that point of view, because the Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett pursued basically the exact same policies that Netanyahu has pursued. There was not really a shift in direction, meaning they continue to expand settlements. They continue to guarantee that settlers who commit violence will face no accountability for the violence that they commit. Israel continued to accelerate its policies of demolishing Palestinian homes. Israel continued to impose the blockade on Gaza. And so I'm not entirely sure I agree with that premise. Especially Naftali Bennett is just as right wing as Bibi Netanyahu. And there was even an interview that came out with Bennett just a week ago, where a journalist asked Naftali Bennett, he asked, what do you think of what do you think of all of these Palestinian civilians dying in Gaza as a result of Israeli bombs? And he basically said something to the effect of, who cares about the Palestinians in Gaza? Who cares about them? I care about Israel. He basically said himself, he shows no remorse. He doesn't care at all about Palestinian civilians dying in Gaza. So I'm not really sure I agree with that premise. Why Israel's again? We already answered that one. The war between Hamas and Israel, without considering humanitarian law, would have been conducted by Israel, can be classified as war crimes. That is correct, but there is no sanctions applied to Israel. What is your opinion? Who's going to enforce the international law? Thank you very much, Sri Wartini, for asking that question. Unfortunately, the international law does not have any enforcement mechanism. There's no international police. There's no international military. The UN doesn't have an armed forces. So there's no way to actually enforce international law. And so it's just based on whether or not the member states of the United Nations, whether or not they apply pressure to countries to get them to change their policies. But unfortunately, the international system that we have today does not have any enforcement mechanisms, and so there's no real way to hold Israel accountable. And yeah, it's a good question, and unfortunately, there isn't really a good answer. Israel is known to implement the Dahiya doctrine. How do you see this doctrine when Israel attacks Palestine? The Dahiya doctrine, I have to confess that I'm actually not entirely sure what that is. So, yes, asymmetric warfare. Got it. Okay, so this is the point I made. Yes, I was calling it Israel's policy of basically disproportionality, in which whatever whatever attacks Palestinians commit on Israelis, Israel will react with disproportionate violence. And this is a very consistent policy that Israel has embraced I would say, since 1948, already starting in 48. That was the policy. And it's been one of Israel's most consistent policies for the past 75 years. And it's illegal under international law. International law requires states to act proportionately. When you're attacked, you can attack back proportionately. And so, yeah, it's a central military doctrine, in which I would say is a war crime, you know. But you're right. You're absolutely right. I want to ask about fairness. Why doesn't the UN give a penalty to Israel about the inhumanity? I wish they did. Why don't they? Because the United States sits on the Security Council, and it has veto power. That's the reason. Because the international system that we have, the United Nations that we have, was founded in the aftermath of World War II. And so the countries that won World War II, they sit on the Security Council, right? So it's Russia, it's France, it's Britain, it's the United States, and it's China. Those 5 countries decide whether or not there are penalties that are applied on the rest of the world. And that's just because of the nature of the UN and how it was established in the aftermath of World War II. And I think most people would agree today, France and Britain are like, why are they on the, why isn't Indonesia on the Security Council? Why isn't India on the Security Council? These countries are much bigger and in terms of population and play a much more important role globally. So I completely agree with you that the United Nations is not a fair organization. It does not represent, the Security Council does not represent the globe. It represents the people that won World War II. Maybe I'll just take one more question. I read your article about the disappearance of the use of the term Palestine around 1100. Maybe that, let's not get into that because that's going to... Thank you, Aulia Furman, for asking that question. Maybe you send me a message on Twitter, and I'm happy to talk. I'm happy to answer that question, but it's kind of unrelated to the talk. So, how can we help Gaza? This is a great question. Maybe we'll end with this question by Fikri Adia Fadlallah. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, but I mean, first of all, there are a lot of organizations that are trying their best to provide aid to the people of Gaza. UNICEF, the United Nations organization that supports children. OCHA, the United Nations organization that supports refugees, as well as the Palestinian Red Crescent Society. Those 3 organizations are on the ground in Gaza right now trying to help Palestinians, providing them aid, water, food, and I would say you can donate to those organizations. But ultimately, I think we need to pressure our governments and our elected representatives. That's what we need to do. We need to pressure our governments to apply pressure on Israel. For example, today I just posted a tweet that I said, look, dear Joe Biden, I was planning on voting for you, but you're supporting a genocide in Gaza right now. Those are the words used by genocide scholars, by the way. Scholars and professors and academics who study genocide are now calling what's happening in Gaza right now a genocide. Okay. And so my president, and so I'm trying my best to post publicly and say, listen, if you're going to support this genocide, I will not vote for you in 2024. And I think more people, if they come forward and tell their elected leaders how they feel about the situation, we need to, that will help. We need to apply pressure on our governments, to apply pressure on Israel to end this siege and blockade and ethnic cleansing as well as genocide. And with that, I will pass the mic back to you, Fitria, and just want to say again, thank you so much for having me.
And is there any question here from the student? Yeah.
I have a question, Bu Fitria.
Okay, please. But then too long, yeah. Make it short and.
I'm so sorry. I will speak my language, Bahasa Indonesia, and I hope to Bu Fitria translate my language. Perang Israel-Palestina ini perang agama atau perang soal rebutan wilayah. Terus siapa yang bisa memberhentikan? Kalau tidak diberhentikan nanti habis tuh Palestina dihancurin dengan cara yang sangat dolim. Terima kasih.
Okay, the war happened. Is it about the religious war, or war affected by any others motivations such as territorial? So who can stop the war?
Who can stop the war? I think the United States could stop the war. I think that's probably about it. Because the only country that really has real leverage over Israel is the United States. If the European Union applied sanctions, I don't think Israel would care. If Russia applied sanctions, I don't think they would care. But if the United States said, Israel, we will sanction you if you invade and if you don't lift the siege, then I think that would have an impact.
I'm not sure if I speak the English. Indonesia.
Bisa, Pak.
Dengan soal konflik Israel dan Palestina. Seperti yang kita ketahui, Gaza Israel.
Sorry, okay. Say that why Hamas attack is considered terrorist attack at the same time Israeli attack to Gaza considered. You can say.
I'm sorry, could you just repeat the question one more time?
Said about he asked you about the what is happening in the media when attack Israel from Hamas is considered a terrorist attack, but at the same time when Israel attack Gaza, it's considered self-defense.
Yeah, I very much agree with the question. There's a lot of reasons why. Look, the term terrorist is applied basically to non-state actors. And I didn't make up the rules, but the term terrorist is used by governments and by states to describe organizations that they don't like. And that's the reality of the world we live in. Whereas when governments do exactly the same thing, like when Israel bombs Gaza and kills 6,000 innocent Palestinians in Gaza, it's acting in self-defense, according to the international community, which is totally insane because it's committing exactly the same atrocities. In fact, much worse, 6 times as many Palestinians dead. So it's committing 6 times the amount of lethal violence with no with no pretense that these are military targets. They're destroying innocent people in their homes at night. The vast majority of the people who have been killed are people in their homes. They're bombing civilian buildings, which is terrorism. And so I agree with you that it's unfair. But unfortunately, you know, this is just the way the world works, and this is how this term is used. And I don't agree with it, which is why, as you saw my presentation, I don't like that word terrorist, because it's a tool that is used by governments. Even though no one describes governments with that word, even though they should. So I don't like that word, and I usually try and avoid it. So I appreciate the question.
Bu Fitria, can I have a question, please? Can I ask some question?
Okay,
Hello, Bu Pia, can you hear me?
Dr. Zahari, do you still have time?
I can do maybe one or two more questions. Sure, yeah.
More question, okay then.
Yep.
You want to, okay, please be short, yeah, please.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Bu Fitria. I just want to go back to the history, Dr. Zahari Foster. Thank you so much for having with us today. And I would like to know about, as we know that the state of Israel was designed by Theodor Herzl, in 1997. And also they declare as the theoretic state, and also based on according to the teaching of Talmud. And they talk about in Talmud is the holy book of Jews that about Eretz Israel. And we all know that Israel is the only state that with no fixed and clear border, because based on the idea, the constitution, and also there's no border area. But they declare the border is no. I mean, what do you think about the Eretz Israel, which is stated in the Talmud as the holy book of Jews? And the second one is I would like to know about the peace talk or the peace agreement. There's so many peace agreement and peace talk, there was the Camp David agreement and also a peace agreement and also the roadmap. And is this still the effective ways to end this conflict? Because I think there's no significant result from this peace agreement. And what about the concept of two-state resolution? And is it possible? And is still possible to with this kind of concept? And the next question, and maybe last question, how is the U.S. foreign policy to end this conflict? And because I ever knew the information about on the media that the Joe Biden has promised to declare the independence of Palestine, but in other hand, they want Hamas was destroyed and dismissed. And I think it is not fair because Hamas is a part of the people of Palestine. Maybe that's all the question. Thank you so much, Dr. Zahari.
Okay, so on the first question with regard to the land of Israel in Jewish thought and Jewish theology, for 2,000 years, basically Jews were living scattered around the world. The main attitude among among rabbis and Jewish scholars throughout most of this entire time period was that God will decide when the coming of the Messiah will come, and only at that time, when God decides, will the Jewish people return to the land of Israel. Any action taken by the Jewish people themselves to hasten and accelerate that process of return is against Jewish law. And that was the attitude of most Jewish theologians for most of the past 2,000 years. Only in the 19th century did Jews start to say, we're going to start moving to Palestine. And as a result, many of the Orthodox Jews actually rejected the Zionist movement because it was in violation of Torah law. So that's the first question. Now, with regard to the second question, with regard to the two-state solution, I can't remember exactly the question you asked, but it was basically like, is this still a viable solution? Do we still think that there can be two states between the river and the sea? I think the answer is no. And the reason is because for the past, I would say 30 years, 40 years even, Israel has been expanding its control over the Palestinian territories. Today, you have 800,000 Israeli settlers living in the Palestinian territories everywhere, and you have Israeli-only roads connecting them, and you have Israeli, electricity lines and Israeli water pipes, and you have, basically the state of Israel has total and full control over all of the West Bank. And so in my mind, it's basically inconceivable to think that Israel would actually withdraw all of its military out of the West Bank, and that it would actually give Palestinians real autonomy and real sovereignty in the West Bank. So I don't think that's really a plausible solution anymore. Maybe it was 20 years ago, but today it doesn't even seem possible, So I don't really think it's a viable solution anymore. And to answer your third question, what is the role that the U.S. is playing in the conflict, in this conflict? I believe, the U.S. is playing a very detrimental role. It is empowering and enabling Israel to commit war crimes in Gaza. It is empowering and enabling Israel to maintain its apartheid regime in the West Bank. The U.S. plays a very, very detrimental role in this conflict, and which is regrettable because it's the world superpower and it has the ability to change things, but it's not.
Okay, I think there are some more questions from Win Polisongo and from Universitas Smart and any others. I think we don't have any more time, so I think maybe they can follow your Twitters or catch up in any other question.
Thank you.
Okay, we have to wrap up the discussion, and maybe we have to give big applause here, from here to Dr. Zahari. And
yeah, thank you.
From university, from the faculty, we have little bit, a little appreciation for your presence.
Thank you so much. That is so kind of you. I really appreciate that.
So much.
I'll take a screenshot. Okay. Thank you guys so much. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zahari. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. MC continued. Thank you so much for the audience's Zoom meeting, and we will see you again in the next events. Thank you again for joining us. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Next in line, before we get to the closing of the event for today, we're going to have a group photo session. The first photo session would be for the Zoom audience. So, for the audience in the Zoom meeting, you will turn on your camera. Please, for the audience in Zoom, you may turn on your camera for the photo session. Okay, the photo will take from 1, 2, 3. One more, maybe. Okay, the photo will take from 1, 2, 3. Okay, maybe enough. Now for the second session of the group photo, for the audience in this theater, you may move to the middle of the theater to take a group photo together. Boleh ke tengah untuk hadirin yang ada di ruangan ini. Silakan boleh ke tengah ke tangga, dipadukin aja ke tengah.
Ya.
Hilang.